Her smile was stitched tighter than her corset. You couldn't see the bruises beneath the silk. You couldn't hear the crack of bone over the rustle of lace. But if you looked closely, closer than society ever dared, you might have seen it. The way her breath was borrowed. The way her posture was pain-carved into elegance. This isn't just a story about fashion. It's a story about obedience, about control, about a woman whose body became a battleground, and whose silence became her rebellion. History will tell you she was beautiful. We will tell you what it cost. She wasn't born into freedom. She was born into ribbon. Her first breath passed through fabric that was already tightened, already adorned. Before she ever learned to speak, she learned to hold her stomach in. Straight posture was praised before she could walk. Beauty was not something to grow into. It was something to be sculpted, molded, and disciplined into existence. And so, every morning began with the same ritual. The cold fingers of a maid pulling at laces. One breath, her last of freedom, then came the tightening, the pulling, until her ribs ached, until her ears rang, until her body forgot itself and remembered only form, the form of a woman acceptable to others. Her mother stood by, sometimes adjusting a sleeve, sometimes simply watching, with approval, with pride, and with a silence that hid something else, envy. She knew, as all women of her station knew, that beauty was not indulgence. It was currency. To be wanted was to be saved. To be plain was to disappear. And to be free, to be truly free, was to be ruined. The corset wasn't clothing, it was commandment, a symbol, a charm warding off failure, polished shackles parading as elegance. It forced the back straight, the chest forward, the waist vanishing. It taught the body to obey, to shut up, to sit still. It was her passport to society, her ticket into family, into meaning, into mattering. Without it, she was no one. With it, she was everything, but no longer herself. As she grew, her waist grew smaller, not by nature, but by pressure. Her bones gave way, her organs shifted, her breath became a shallow compromise. But her face glowed. She had mastered the art of smiling through pain. That smile became her armor, her camouflage. The world didn't want to see a woman suffering to be beautiful. It wanted the illusion of effortlessness, of grace, of composure. Her body bore the war. Her face wore the peace. At a ball one evening she fainted. No one panicked. Girls fainted all the time, from the heat, from nerves, from too much excitement, but mostly from the crushing weight of silk, whalebone, and expectation. They carried her to a private room, waved smelling salts under her nose. When she awoke, an older woman murmured with a proud chuckle, "Now that is a real lady, just like the heroines in novels." Her pride flared. Her ribs cracked. Every lace on her back was a pair of eyes watching. Every pierced stitch was someone else's choice. She didn't own her body. It was property leased by culture. Men wanted to possess her like a statue in a gallery. Mothers sculpted her like clay meant to become a wife. Dressmakers twisted her into the shape of fantasy. And she simply tried not to disappoint, not herself. Them. But don't mistake her for weak. She was surviving. She didn't stay silent because she lacked a voice. She stayed silent because noise was dangerous. Loudness made her ugly. And ugliness was a death sentence. Better a broken rib than an unwanted glance. Better breathless than forgotten. There in that paradox lived her strength. She endured not from ignorance but from wisdom. She bent not from weakness but from strategy. Her silence was not emptiness. It was the last choice they left her. At night in solitude she sometimes removed the corset, slowly, carefully, as if peeling off another person's skin. The marks remained, the bruises, the burning sensations as blood returned to areas long suppressed. She would look in the mirror and not recognize herself. Without laces, without shape. She felt formless, wrong, like freedom was unnatural. And in that moment she understood. The system had won. Not because it forced her to wear the corset, but because she reached for it willingly, even when no one was watching. She fantasized sometimes of another world, another century, one where she could dance barefoot, laugh too loud, eat without shame, breathe, not halfway, but fully. But morning always came. The maid always returned with tea, and next to it the corset lay waiting, The same one. Fresh lavender, faint scent of blood. She smiled. She stood, and she stepped into her cage once more. Because life was theater, and if you weren't on stage, you were already erased. Yet something began to shift, slowly, quietly, not in rebellion but in pause, a hesitation before tightening the cords, a glance in the mirror that felt more like a question than a routine. She still wore the corset, still smiled, still danced, but something inside her was starting to ask, why? That seed of doubt, that flicker of thought is more dangerous than fire. It doesn't scream, it whispers, it doesn't fight, it observes. It is patient, but it is relentless. And it had been planted, not in her lungs or her waist, but in her mind. And minds are the one all these corsets cannot reach. Her silence changed. It wasn't submission anymore. It was a kind of waiting, a knowing, a memory that bodies are not meant to be prisons, that breath is not weakness, that beauty does not require pain. She didn't yet know when or how. But she sensed that one day she would take it off, not for the night, but for good. And on that day, history would not call her a beauty. It would call her a problem, a scandal, a disruption, but maybe, eventually, a symbol, that even if they break your ribs, they cannot own your soul, that even if you smile while suffering, the smile can become rebellion, that the most dangerous woman of all is the one who wears her silence like a blade, and knows exactly where to aim it. They called it elegance, but it was elegance sharpened into obedience, polished into performance. For her there was no such thing as simply being. Every gesture, every breath, every step across a drawing-room floor had to be choreographed like a ballet, controlled, effortless, pleasing. Her presence was an offering, her silence, a song sung in someone else's key. She wasn't living, she was enduring the art of womanhood as defined by the hands of men and the whispers of women who had survived long enough to enforce it. When she walked into a room, eyes didn't just follow, eyes measured. Her waist, her smile, her stillness. Men praised her posture. So graceful, they said, never realizing that grace came from pain, from muscle memory trained to flinch at pleasure, from lungs that had learned to breathe in quarters, from a spine stiffened by steel and shame. The elegance they adored was not natural. It was extracted, surgically, socially, spiritually. She became the ideal, but the ideal was a cage. And in that cage, a quiet madness was growing. She knew how to host, how to bow, how to sit without her dress wrinkling. She knew how to giggle without showing too much teeth, how to walk without letting her hips speak. She knew the temperature of every room and the ego of every man in it. She had been taught diplomacy, flattery, submission, the holy trinity of survival for a woman of her class. But no one taught her what to do with the scream inside her, the one that lived just under her ribs, the one that never quite made it to her throat because beauty had no room for noise. There were moments, fleeting, forbidden, when she wanted to tear it all off. The corset, the jewelry, the name, the lineage, to run barefoot into the woods and let herself rot or bloom, anything but pose. But she couldn't, because where would she go? Who would she be? In a world where women were shaped like sculpture and expected to be silent like marble, freedom was not a destination. It was exile. Once, during a dinner party, she laughed too loudly. Just once. The sound escaped her before she could kill it. Heads turned. A silence fell over the table like a dropped curtain. A man, older, powerful, always watching, raised an eyebrow. "So spirited," he said, the way one might speak of a horse that needed breaking. She blushed, not from shame, but from recognition. She had revealed herself, and she had been seen. That night, in her chamber, she stood before the mirror and stared at the outline of her corset, the indentations left in her skin, the way her body bore the proof of its training. A sudden intrusive thought, what if I stopped smiling? Would they flinch? Would the world crumble? But no. She smiled again, as always, because she had been taught that a woman's rebellion must be soft, silent, invisible, that if you're going to burn, burn slowly, in secret, like a candle, 1 inch at a time. She wasn't the only one. The other women knew. They saw it too. The little bruises that everyone pretended were clumsy accidents, the faint coughs that came from lungs pressed too tight, The whispers exchanged behind fans, eyes darting like birds in a gilded cage. But none of them spoke it aloud, because if one broke the illusion, all would suffer. That was the cruel brilliance of the system. It made accomplices out of its prisoners. The most respected woman in her circle had a waist so thin it could be encircled with 2 hands. People marveled. They said she looked like an hourglass. But no one noticed she could barely eat, that her back ached from the effort of holding in every breath, every hunger, every truth. She once confided, after too much wine, that she hadn't drawn a full breath in years. She laughed, then wept, then laughed again, and the next morning wore the tightest corset anyone had ever seen, because regret is permissible, rebellion is not. And so the game continued. She learned how to weaponize the beauty, how to play the role so convincingly that no one would ever question if it was a role. She knew that if you want to win, you can't just survive, you must enchant. And she did. Men fell, women envied. Invitations came. Her image flawless, her posture perfect, her lungs silent, her ribs, hairline fractured, but her smile never broke. Until one day it did. It was during a fitting. A new corset, imported, lighter, stronger, crueler. She stood with arms outstretched as the maid tightened the laces. A little more, and a little more. The room blurred. Her ears rang, and then snap. A sound, small but unmistakable. She gasped, not from the pain, from the truth. A rib. Cracked, maybe 2. The maid panicked, loosened the laces, but she raised her hand. "No," she said, "and keep going." The maid hesitated. She repeated, "Keep going." And so the laces pulled tighter, around the break, around the rupture, around the proof that beauty had won. Her breath came shallow, her back trembled, but her face? Calm, smiling, always smiling, because pain was not failure, pain was proof. Later that evening at the ball, she descended the stairs like nothing had happened. No one could tell. No one would ever know. She danced, she dined, she posed. Her body was screaming, but the room was applauding. In that moment she felt it fully, the insanity of it all. The absurdity of a world where you could be dying and still be praised for looking beautiful. A world where the elegance of your suffering mattered more than the truth of your pain. She looked around the room and realized something horrifying. Every woman there was smiling. Every one of them knew. And still they danced. It's a strange kind of silence, the one that follows when your body begins to betray you. Not loud, not violent, just quieter than usual. Your laughter softens, your appetite vanishes, your footsteps feel rehearsed as if they belonged to someone else. That night after the ball, she sat in her chamber, corset still fastened, the pain under her ribs pulsing in rhythm with her heartbeat. She didn't cry, not because it didn't hurt, but because the tears would smear her perfection. And even alone in the dark, she still felt watched. The corset had become more than fabric. It was a boundary, a skin beneath the skin. To remove it was to step into a kind of existential nakedness, but this time she unfastened the hook slower than usual, not because she was savoring the release, but because she was afraid of what she might find underneath. Her hands trembled. The last tug of the ribbon fell slack, and she inhaled. Sharp, deep, painful. And in that moment she realized something unbearable. She didn't know how to breathe anymore. She had forgotten how it felt to be full, to expand, to exist without compression. Her chest rose awkwardly, like a bird trying to remember how to fly. Her muscles twitched with confusion. Her lungs rebelled against the sudden space. And all she could think was, "This is what I gave away." Outside her window the world moved indifferently. Horse carriages, laughter in the streets, music echoing from a nearby terrace. And here she was, sitting half-dressed in a chair built for decorum, her body humming with the cost of being loved. Because that's what they said it was, right? Love, affection, admiration, desire, all bestowed upon her in exchange for silence, stillness, sacrifice. The world rewarded her for not being real. And so she became a ghost in her own story. Every day her body grew weaker. Not visibly. She still looked like porcelain. But the cracks had deepened. The headaches were now daily, the dizziness constant. The maids whispered to each other when they thought she couldn't hear. She's getting paler. She eats less. She's not sleeping. She heard them. Of course she did. But she said nothing. Because what was she supposed to say? That the corset hadn't just reshaped her figure, it had stolen her instincts? That she no longer knew when she was hungry? Or tired? Or sad? She remembered reading once in some old book that women in ancient cultures used to wear armor into battle. Heavy, brutal, beautiful armor. She thought of that now. Her corset was her armor. Not to fight, but to be seen. And being seen was the only way to survive. But armor isn't meant to be worn forever. She began to dread the mirror. Not because she didn't like what she saw, but because she didn't recognize it. The image was still perfect. High cheeks, flawless hair, a neck swan-like and serene. But the eyes had receded. There was a distance in them, like a woman watching herself from far away. She would smile, and the smile would hold, but behind it, something trembled, a fracture in the marble. One morning during another fitting, the dressmaker offered a new corset. "Tighter waist, more structure," she said proudly. "You'll look like a dream." And for the first time in years she hesitated. The seamstress waited. She lifted the corset slowly, studied it, ran her fingers across the boning, counted the stitches. It was beautiful, cold, white, immaculate. She could already feel how it would shape her, already hear the compliments, already know the music that would play as she floated into another ballroom, flawless and fragile. But something in her refused. Not violently, not even aloud, just a flicker of refusal, a whisper in her spine. She handed it back. "Not today," she said. The room froze. The seamstress blinked. "But, miss, your appearance—" "I said not today." The seamstress nodded, stiffly, gathered the corset and left. And the moment the door shut, she exhaled, fully, painfully, deliciously. Her lungs stretched like they hadn't in years. Her back curved naturally for the first time since childhood. And then quietly to herself she laughed. It wasn't graceful. It wasn't elegant. It wasn't feminine. It was real. And that made it dangerous. Because now she knew. Now she knew the lie. That perfection was not a gift. It was a demand. That beauty was not a blessing. It was a leash. That every smile she wore had been stitched with compliance. And once you know the lie, you can't unknow it. She began to test the boundaries gently. She sat differently at dinner, let her voice grow louder in conversation, wore her hair slightly looser, chose fabrics that breathed. The changes were small, but to the world around her they were seismic. Women noticed. Some were intrigued, some disapproved. Men noticed. One asked if she was unwell. Another told her she looked more mature lately, a polite way of saying less doll-like. But she didn't care, not anymore, because something strange was happening. She was starting to feel alive. It wasn't easy. Her body still hurt. The fractures didn't heal overnight. There were days she wanted to return to the comfort of constraint, to be adored, even if it meant being diminished. But then she would catch her reflection, shoulders relaxed, eyes clearer, and remember, this is what truth looks like. It's not always pretty, but it is always free. And freedom, once tasted, is not something the body forgets, even if it costs you everything. The body remembers what the mind denies. It remembers the breath it was never allowed to take, the posture it was forced to hold, the hunger it had to hide. And when it's no longer bound, it doesn't return to peace. It returns to chaos. The body shakes, trembles, resists. It doesn't rejoice, it recoils, because pain too becomes a home. For weeks she felt like she was falling apart. Without the corset she moved differently, awkwardly, clumsily. Her center of gravity shifted. Her muscles ached. Her spine, long used to support from that steel and string, struggled to carry the weight of her own head. The mirror revealed not a goddess, but a ghost in transition. Shoulders sloping, waist less defined, a strange softness returning to the belly and thighs. And worst of all, freedom didn't feel good. It felt like failure. She missed the attention, the whispers of envy, the applause in men's eyes. Now she caught sidelong glances, not of admiration, but of concern, of critique. of confusion. "Are you feeling quite yourself?" they asked. "You seem tired." "You're different lately." Yes, she was different, and no one liked it. What they loved was the version of her that didn't exist. The sculpture, the idea, the illusion. But this woman who breathed loudly, who coughed in public, who let her stomach expand when she laughed, she was no longer a symbol. She was something worse. A question. Because if she no longer played the part, what did that mean for the play? She walked through gardens she used to glide through. She sat on chairs she used to perch on like porcelain, and with every unrestrained movement she felt the world lean back slightly, as if her freedom were infectious, as if it might spread. And it did. One morning a younger girl, sweet-faced, 15, barely formed, approached her after breakfast. "I saw what you wore yesterday," she said shyly. "It looked comfortable." There was a silence between them, not awkward, sacred. The girl hesitated, then added, "Mother says I'm ready for tighter lacing this season." Her voice cracked on the word tighter. She didn't answer right away. She only looked at the girl's waist, still soft, still hers, and remembered what it was like to breathe without guilt. "You don't have to start yet," she said softly. "Wait until your body tells you it's ready." The girl blinked. No one had ever spoken of the body as something with a voice, with a right to timing, to choice. It had always been something to conquer, to tame. "Will it ever be ready?" the girl asked. She looked into her eyes and replied, "Maybe it was never supposed to be." The conversation ended there, but something lingered. A new idea, a dangerous one. Because that's how rebellion begins. Not with a scream, but with a suggestion. She began noticing things she hadn't before. Other women fidgeting at the table. Older women clutching their sides in secret. Tiny winces disguised as smiles. She realized the whole room was a performance, and underneath the velvet and silk there were fractures everywhere, women holding themselves together with thread and willpower. And yet no one broke character. Until one did. At a winter banquet one of the duchesses fainted, a dramatic theatrical fall, but when they helped her up, she refused the salts. She stood slowly, wobbling, then said something no one expected. "I can't breathe in this damn thing." Silence. She said it again, louder. "I said I can't breathe." And then, right there in the ballroom, in front of the dukes and generals and countesses, she reached behind her back and loosened the laces herself. Her chest expanded with a sigh so deep it echoed off the chandeliers. Her face turned red, not with embarrassment, but with blood, with oxygen, with life. A scandal. A miracle. A warning. The room didn't know what to do. Some laughed nervously, others pretended not to see, but she watched, closely, not the Duchess, but the other women. She watched their pupils dilate, their hands twitch, their lungs tighten in mimicry, and she knew the revolution had already begun, not in the streets, in the ribcage. That night she wrote in her journal for the first time in years, not about society, not about dresses or suitors or invitations, but about sensation, about pain, about the smell of air after rain, about hunger and fullness, about what it means to be human when no one is watching. She ended the entry with a single line, "I am not beautiful. I am becoming." And that word, becoming, carried more power than any title, any corset, any flattery, because to become is to change. And change terrifies the ones who depend on your stillness. Soon whispers followed, that she had grown odd, that she was too modern, that perhaps she had fallen ill, that maybe quietly she had gone mad. She didn't defend herself. Let them whisper. Let them invent stories. The truth was simple. She had remembered she had a body, and that remembering changed everything. She no longer sought the mirror's permission. She no longer waited for praise to feel worthy. She no longer bent to the expectations of rooms full of fragile men and frightened women. She existed, unevenly, inconsistently, but wholly. And in doing so, she became something rarer than beautiful. She became real. There is a moment, quiet, almost invisible, when a woman stops performing, not publicly, not dramatically, but deeply, inwardly, as if some final thread snaps between the soul and the costume, and the weight of pretending simply falls away. Not with a scream, not with a declaration, just with a breath. And for her that moment came in the least expected place. A church. She had gone out of obligation. A family ceremony. Layers of expectation wrapped her shoulders like a shroud. As she sat among the pews, surrounded by lace veils and obedient postures, she felt the old ghosts stir again. The ones that whispered about elegance, about grace, about remaining small, quiet, soft. But this time they didn't speak as loudly, because she had stopped listening. The sermon echoed through the vaulted space, about sin, about duty, about the sanctity of roles. The priest's voice was solemn, proud. He spoke of Eve, of the fall, of woman as origin of temptation, as danger in disguise. And suddenly she saw it all. How history had been written on women's bodies. Not with ink, but with pressure, with lace and silence and pain made to look like posture. She thought of all the daughters who had inherited shame like it was jewelry, all the mothers who had passed it down like an heirloom, and all the girls who never questioned it, because to question meant isolation. That was the final cruelty. You were trained to harm yourself and then left alone with the wound. But she wasn't alone now. Not truly, because the more she let go, the more she noticed others letting go too. Not in rebellion, but in recognition. The girl from before, the one afraid of tight lacing, now walked with her back relaxed, her waist unbound. A cousin once obsessed with her figure had begun to wear loose gowns, claiming comfort was the new sophistication. Even the housekeeper, old and stiff in tradition, now allowed herself to sigh audibly at the end of the day. Small things, soft rebellions, but together they formed something real. Not a revolution of banners or slogans, but of breath. Still, freedom has a cost, and soon the invitations stopped arriving. Her name was quietly omitted from social calendars. Suitors declined to call. Her mother, once so proud of her perfection, now looked at her with a mixture of fear and pity. "You're throwing it all away," she whispered one night. "You were so close to everything we dreamed for you." And she smiled, because that's what no one understood. The dream had never been hers. It had been built for her, around her, without asking if she wanted it, and now they mourned its unraveling like it was a death. But it wasn't death. It was birth. Birth is bloody, painful, loud. It is not graceful. It is not elegant. And yet it is the most sacred thing a body can do. She was being born again, into her own shape. And for the first time, she didn't care if the world approved of that shape. Let them call her ruined. Let them call her strange. Let them say she had lost her way. She had not lost her way. She had left the path that was killing her. That path had been carved in bone, laid out in etiquette manuals, etched in the tight smiles of mothers and the empty eyes of brides. It led to admiration, to security, to being remembered as a fine woman, but never as a full person. Now, when she walked into a room, people looked, but not with adoration, with discomfort, with curiosity, with suspicion, and she welcomed it. Because when people are comfortable around your suffering, you must make them uncomfortable with your freedom. She started writing again. Long letters unsent, poems unfinished, thoughts scribbled onto scraps of fabric and hidden in drawers, not to be read, just to be said. Because language, like the body, needed a way out. And for once, the words didn't have to please. They didn't have to be soft or sweet or correct. They only had to be true. One night she stood before her mirror. No corset, no jewelry, just skin. And she whispered to her reflection, "You survived." Not in the dramatic way of battlefields or revolutions, but in the quiet way that women have always survived. By remembering, by refusing, by breathing when they are told not to. She traced the faint scar where a rib had once cracked. A souvenir, a line in her story, and she smiled. Not the smile they had taught her, but the smile that came from within. The kind that breaks nothing, except illusions. They won't tell you her name. It will not appear in textbooks. You won't find her portrait in a museum or her quotes carved in marble. She did not lead an army or write a treatise. She did not start a revolution with fire or words or weapons, but she started one all the same. They'll remember the dress, the waistline, the perfect silhouette she wore like armor. They'll recall the parties, the compliments, the performance of womanhood she mastered better than anyone else. They'll speak of how she used to shine, before she faded, before she changed, before she chose herself over the world. but they will never say why. They'll bury the truth under phrases like, she grew distant, she became odd, she lost her way. They'll reduce her to a cautionary tale. Don't end up like her. She had everything. She gave it up. They will not understand that what she gave up was a lie, and what she gained was breath. She was not admired in the end. She was not crowned or adored. She was simply left alone, and yet she never once asked to be saved, because she had already saved herself. She lived quietly after that, not in shame, but in clarity. She no longer entered rooms like a painting. She entered like a person, no longer watched but witnessing. And what she saw, now that she was no longer blinded by flattery, was haunting. She saw girls barely 16 pulling at ribbons until their skin bruised. She saw women in their 40s whispering of hunger like it was a virtue. She saw dying mothers clutching corsets tighter than memories, still afraid to take up space. And she knew. They were all waiting for permission to stop. She could not give it to them. That wasn't how change worked. You couldn't gift freedom, you could only show what it looked like. So she lived it, fully, flawed, free. She walked slower, spoke louder, stopped smiling when it wasn't honest. Some days she felt invisible, others, untouchable. She was no longer praised, but she was no longer possessed, and that to her was worth more than any ballroom ever offered. Years passed. The world changed, slightly, then rapidly. New fabrics, new fashions, new voices rising, trembling, then roaring. Eventually corsets fell out of favor. Breathing became stylish again, and young women, generations later, would lift their arms without pain, and never wonder what that freedom had cost. They would never know about the ribs that cracked, the lungs that shrank, the girls who collapsed in silence and were carried out like ghosts in silk. They would never know about her. But sometimes, rarely, one might find an old photograph in a forgotten album. A woman seated, posture upright but unbound, eyes steady, mouth closed, not in obedience, but in wisdom. They'd ask, who was she? And someone would say, oh, no one important. But they'd be wrong, because the ones who refuse to be named are often the ones who broke the spell. She did not write history, but she unraveled it, thread by thread, ribbon by ribbon, smile by smile, until one day a girl would stand before a mirror, unlace her corset and not feel shame, but relief, not guilt, but power. And somewhere, in a memory the world tried to erase, a woman without a name would exhale into the silence, finally free.